So you've probably noticed by now that our worship format has been changing a little bit here and a little bit there every week. Around the time of Pentecost, I think it was, before Pentecost, I noticed that it seemed like our services were becoming very predictable and, dare I say, even a little bit boring. And so I decided that in light of the declining enthusiasm, that it was time to maybe freshen things up and tweak the services a little to hopefully deepen our spiritual engagement with our Creator and with each other. And so I've noticed that this has been a very positive change. A lot of people have approached me and said they like the centering and putting the announcements at the end so that we have time to just really center in what we're doing and be more intentional in our worship. And so I have found that that's been so good that I have committed myself to continue doing this and continue finding new ways for us to worship and be surprised together and do this in a more intentional fashion. Now, another thing that I have noticed as I have been doing some studying is that pastors, too, need to change their style. It seems like we all find a comfortable place, a comfortable way to preach, and we end up sticking with that and falling into a rut. And I think that over time, not intentionally, but we kind of end up going through the motions. And so my pattern, my comfortable place, is to always have my tablet here and to craft out my sermon well in advance, to really think it over, to tweak it, to make it say just the perfect thing, which is fine, but sometimes I think that I need to learn to shake things up and learn to preach a little bit differently. So today, I'm going to toss out the tablet. I don't have my tablet. I have bullet points here. I don't have a script. And I'm going to be a little more conversational in this sermon. I'm going to be a little more off the cuff in my speaking. Now, I have to be honest with you. This is a very big risk for me. This takes me way out of my comfort zone. I'm literally shaking right now, just to be honest with you. But that's a good thing, because I'm very much aware of what's going on right now, and I know that I'm not bored. You might be bored by the end of it, but I'm definitely not bored. And since today's topic is actually on human vulnerability, I thought what better time to not only preach on the topic, but to actually do it while I'm preaching it. So this is me being very vulnerable, which hopefully will make me more authentic, and it will leave a lot of room for God's light to shine through the cracks of my uncertainty. It will be very uncomfortable, but I am trusting God to carry me through this whole thing, and let's just see where it goes together. So will you please pray with me? Loving God, as we move into this time of listening for the wisdom of your word, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you. Amen. So, we are once again picking up Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. And if you were here last week, you will remember that we read a portion of the letter that talked about forgiveness. Briefly, to summarize, there was someone in the congregation who had been stirring the pot and making trouble, casting aspersions on Paul and the gentlemen who were going around with him. And the congregation was really fed up with this whole thing, and they just wanted to get rid of the offenders. Well, Paul had no problem with the church dealing with the matter and confronting the offender and handling it, but he saw that they were carrying it a little too far and they were shunning the offender. And so in his letter he says, now look, wait a minute guys, it's good to deal with this stuff, but we are called to forgive. That's the thing that Jesus tells us over and over and over, to forgive. So this guy who's paid the price, let's ease up on him and let's offer him some forgiveness. So that was a really good lesson. What a lot of people probably don't know is that Paul actually wrote 4 letters to the Corinthians that we know of. We have 2 of them in the Bible, but then there were 2 others that were lost. And I think that scholars have surmised this by references in other letters to these 2 lost letters. So what that kind of tells us is that the Corinthian church was probably Paul's biggest headache. They were gifted, they were very gifted financially, they were gifted spiritually, but they were a mess. They were full of problems. There were sexually immoral activities going on in the congregation. They were constantly bickering. They were taking each other to court. And then there was a segment of the population who were making challenges to Paul's apostleship, which was a very sore spot for Paul because, as you may recall, Paul is the only apostle who never actually encountered Jesus in the physical life. So it really was a thorn in his side when somebody would make a claim to that. The individuals who were making those claims were the Jewish Christians who we refer to as Judaizers. And it was their school of thought that if you wanted to follow Christ, not only did you need to believe in Christ, but you also had to conform to the Mosaic laws, or the laws that were in the Old Testament. And what that meant was you had to follow the dietary restrictions, and of course if you were a male, you had to undergo circumcision. Now Paul was adamantly opposed to this, and he dealt with it in his letter to the Galatians extensively, but in this portion of the letter, he's addressing it to some extent because it's these Judaizers who are influencing members of the Corinthian congregation and causing them to have some questions about Paul's authority. The early church, I think, was a lot like the modern church in the fact that there was this polarization. On the one hand, there was the school of thought that you had to do things in order to earn your salvation. And then there was Paul's school of thought, which was that salvation is a gift from God. It's something that is given freely. It's not something that we can earn. We couldn't earn it if we wanted to. It's a free gift from God. And I think that that kind of reflects the church today. We've got people who are of a more fundamental nature and believe every word of the Bible and that it has to be followed to the letter. And then there are people on the other extreme who are referred to as progressives who think that, God's salvation is offered freely, and they can kind of go to extremes with that too. So there's these 2 polar ends, but I think most of us kind of fall somewhere in the middle, and I think that we switch places, as we're traveling our spiritual path, we kind of switch back and forth. I know I do. And that's a good thing. That means you're being intentional and you're paying attention to what is going on. But back to the letter, Paul is actually speaking up in his own defense and in defense of the gentlemen who are traveling around with him. And basically what he's saying is this message that we're bringing to you, this isn't about us. You know, we're just the messengers. You've heard the term, don't shoot the messenger. Well, that's kind of what he's saying, but really what he's saying is that we're nobodies. We're these clay jars holding this really beautiful, rare treasure, but essentially we're imperfect, ordinary, and fragile, just like clay jars, filled with the treasure of God's grace. Salvation is not something that we have any control over. It's not something you have any control over. Salvation is not something a human being can orchestrate. That is God. God fills these empty clay pots with that salvation. So it's a very beautiful analogy when you think about it and really study on it. When I was in the Holy Land, I had the opportunity to visit Tel Megiddo, which is an ancient excavation site in northern Israel. And while I was there, I found these pottery shards, and I was so excited. You would have thought that I had found gold bars. I thought, man, I've got this really rare treasure. This is so cool. Well, people find them all the time there. I didn't know that, but I thought I'd done a little excavating of my own. But then, to further my pain, someone pointed out to me that finding these shards was basically the equivalent of somebody in the future finding a piece of one of our cardboard boxes. So that kind of deflated me a little bit, but not a lot. I'm still thrilled because you can see the grooves, and I know that someone crafted this thousands of years ago and held it, and here I am holding it. So it's not worth a lot of money, but to me it's got a lot of value. And I think that in terms of what Paul is saying, this kind of helps us understand that the value of a clay pot back then was zero. I think it would probably equate to the value of a plastic Walmart bag today. Paul might say, if he was writing this letter today, we're plastic Walmart bags carrying around this precious treasure inside. You know, and the point of that is to prevent anyone from comparing our power, our measly little nothing power, to the amazing, incredible, unfathomable power of God. And we do have a tendency to think that God working through us is really us. And so Paul's kind of bringing us back down to earth by using metaphors for our human vulnerability to point out that, you know, pots crack and they break easily. And that shows that, you know, we're flawed. Human beings are flawed. There's absolutely nothing we can do about that. We can't shake our flaws no matter what we do. But you know what? Some people spend their entire lives trying to cover up their flaws. And they're selling themselves short when they do that. We're selling ourselves short. I do it. I have a tendency to do it. But when we try to cover up our flaws, what we're doing is making it harder for God's light to shine through. When we risk exposure of who we truly are, when we're willing to let those cracks show, God's grace can rush right in there and fill in those cracks, and the light can shine, and it is absolutely beautiful. And so last week we talked about forgiveness, and I think that really ties into this topic very well. Because as we know, forgiveness is very important to our spiritual health. Regardless of what the offender has done, it's important to our spiritual health to go through the process of forgiveness. Because when you go through that process of forgiveness, you bring things out into the open. The process gives us the opportunity to tell our story, to name our hurts, and then offer that forgiveness and either move forward in the relationship or move out of the relationship, whatever the outcome of the whole thing is. The point is that you have opened it up. You have exposed the wound rather than just shrugging it off and saying, whatever. We do that a lot when people hurt us. But when we do that, it's covering up these wounds. And it allows them to fester and go unattended and to become infected. And these wounds, they have a tendency to fill up with some pretty nasty stuff. And if we don't expose that, eventually that nasty stuff is going to come pouring out in one direction or another. So when we expose those wounds, when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable and tell the story and name the hurt, that allows the healing grace of God to enter in. And we don't have to sit there and fester. So with all of these advantages to being vulnerable, why is it that we are so afraid of being vulnerable? We're all afraid of it. I am. I'm terrified of being vulnerable. But I've learned throughout this journey that it's a necessary part of the journey, and it's been a very painful process for me to learn how to peel back some of these layers and expose myself. Now, I have a long way to go. It's a process. But what I have come to understand as I have been working my way through this process, and I've done a lot of thinking about it, what I've come to understand is that the reason we're here, our whole reason for being alive and existing, is connection. Connection with each other. We yearn for healthy relationships and a sense of belonging. And so that is the most important thing to us. And so our biggest fear is that we're not worthy of those connections. We're not worthy of those relationships. So if I'm vulnerable, if I expose myself, you might not like me. So I better cover it up just in case. And we're taught that from an early age. I don't know about you all, but when we would go visit people, my family, my parents would always tell us, now be on your best behavior. Don't act like you do at home. Okay? The message was cover up, pretend, hide. And it's not just that forum where the message is coming from. It comes from everywhere. Everywhere you look, there are things telling us that we're not adequate, we're not good enough. Buy this product, cover up this zit, eat this diet pill and lose all of that weight. Be ashamed, feel unworthy. All for the point of pretending to be something that you're not by buying these things. So we're a society of shame. And I have boiled it down to its essence. I believe that shame really is another way of saying our fear of disconnection. Now, here's the rub. This is the rub. Because in order for authentic connection to happen, we have to be vulnerable. We have to have the courage to be our imperfect selves. We have to have the willingness to let go of who it is that we think we should be so that we can be who it is that we are. When we're vulnerable, we are exposing our most beautiful selves. It gives other people an honest mirror to look into. When I openly expose my flaws, you're able to recognize your own flaws. And that makes you feel a little more comfortable with your flaws because there's a kindred spirit who has the same flaws. They're not afraid of showing their flaws. People are accepting their flaws. Maybe they'll accept my flaws too. And it's exponential. We grow together from that. And by exposing our flaws, we're better able to appreciate who we are, our own flaws. And what I've noticed is that some of the world's shame begins to slip away. Maybe just a little part in your little corner of the world, but some of the world's shame begins to slip away. My experience is that when I allow myself to be vulnerable, I am being true to myself. Now, I might step in it really bad. I might mess things up terribly. People might misunderstand my intentions, and that's uncomfortable. But I know that even if I mess up, it was me messing up, not some concocted version of myself that is just another layer of veneer covering up who I really am. And I noticed that when we allow that to happen, we have all these layers and layers of different cover-ups and personalities. And when that personality is messing up, then there's no real lesson to be learned by that personality. The lesson comes from the real person. And so vulnerability peels back that stuff. It helps us learn how to peel back all that stuff and open us up to what that experience has to teach us. Because every experience, whether it's a positive one or a negative one, has something to teach us. When we are open, when we are vulnerable, it doesn't leave room for our pride and our arrogance to insist that there's nothing to examine, that we're fine, there's no problem here. It's a very painful process to go through, to see I messed up, and to make those amends, and to carry that weight for a while, and ponder the meaning and learn from it. But when you do, when you come out on the other side, you come out so much lighter. You come out having shucked that burden, and it is the most amazing feeling in the world. So Paul says that we are like these clay jars that contain this great treasure, because clay jars are vulnerable, they break easily, and many of them contain cracks. So essentially, we are a bunch of cracked pots. But treasure needs light to shine, needs those cracks in order that the light can shine through. Now here is a paradox. This is a paradox. And I think it's one of the biggest human paradoxes. Vulnerability lies at the core of our shame and our fear and our struggle for worthiness. Okay? But it's also the birthplace of joy, creativity, belonging, and love. So all of this stuff meets in the center at that place of our vulnerability. And when we're there, there is greater depth to our relationships, because instinctively people understand that they can trust us. Have you ever noticed that about authentic people? You're drawn to them. You know that you can trust them. They're not perfect, but they're real. And so we're kind of drawn to them. So I want to show you these mugs that I found. I hope you can see them. They're all these crazy, crazy mugs. They're all these funny, different shapes, kind of warped and moving in all sorts of odd directions. I got them a little while back, and I really fell in love with them. I realized, wow, these mugs, they're all crafted by the same artist, and they're all designed to fulfill the same purpose. Some of them do have minor cracks in the bottom, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't keep them from holding hot coffee. They're kind of funky looking, but I wanted them as soon as I saw them, because they remind me that to take people as they are, to appreciate their funkiness and appreciate the beauty of that funkiness. And so I drink my coffee out of a different one every day, and it just kind of reminds me of that. So this life, it's not perfect. It's not for the flawless or the cosmetically correct. There are some parts of us that are very, very good, but there are some parts of us that are aching. There are some parts that no matter how far we extend ourselves, they fall short. And there are some parts that just feel absolutely broken. But those are the parts that let the light in. So don't run from your imperfections. Don't hide your brokenness. When we break a bone, it grows stronger when it mends at the spot of mending. And our broken spots are the spots where the light shines through. Our God is a God of broken pottery. Our God is a God of shattered hearts. And regardless of how broken we are invited to pick ourselves up and to move forward with God inside of us, helping us. And so we, as an ancient broken people, we have journeyed our way across the millennia, bringing a message of hope to a broken planet. Do not despair. Do not surrender. Do not stop. Amen.